Picture this. It's deep into the night, somewhere in ancient southern France, around 35,000 years ago, and the evening has taken a turn that nobody entirely planned. The hunting was exceptional today, genuinely exceptional, the kind of day that happens maybe 3 or 4 times in an entire year. And the group has been celebrating in the way ancient humans celebrated good fortune, which is to say, loudly, with food, with fermented honey that someone's been quietly nursing along in a hollowed gourd for the past 2 weeks, and with a level of collective noise that's either music or something extremely close to it, depending on how generously you're defining the term. But here's where things get genuinely interesting. At some point during this evening, well after the practical concerns of the day have dissolved into the warmth of a well-fed, mildly intoxicated social gathering, an older man in the group does something that has nothing to do with food, warmth, or immediate survival. He picks up a piece of ochre pigment, walks to the cave wall just beyond the firelight, and begins drawing. Not a hunting plan, not a map, not any kind of practical information that directly helps anyone survive. He draws a bison with a human figure standing over it, gives that figure what appear to be antlers, and surrounds the whole scene with patterns that don't represent anything from the physical world at all. When he finishes, several people gather around it quietly. Nobody laughs. Nobody questions why he spent this time on something you can't eat or use. They look at it with the specific kind of serious, directed attention that humans reserve for things they consider genuinely, weightily meaningful. And somewhere, a considerable distance from that cave, a crow is performing its own strange ritual, hopping around the body of a dead flock member, apparently reluctant to simply fly away, apparently doing something that serves no immediate practical function, apparently engaging with death and loss in a way that looks, from a certain angle, almost uncomfortably familiar. So here's the genuinely fascinating, slightly unsettling question this entire video exists to dig into. Do animals actually believe in God? And what does that question have to do with ancient humans drawing human antler hybrids on cave walls after a night of fermented honey and too much laughter? Stick around, because this is one of the most genuinely interesting, most carefully avoided questions in all of evolutionary biology and cognitive science. And by the end of this, your understanding of what religion actually is, where it came from, and who exactly can have it might be considerably more complicated than it was when you started. Let's start by dismantling the question itself slightly. Because asking whether animals believe in God, the way it's phrased in the title, is actually asking several different questions simultaneously, and pulling them apart matters enormously. There's a meaningful difference between asking whether any animal possesses the specific religious beliefs of any particular human tradition, which the answer to is almost certainly no, and asking whether any animals possess the underlying cognitive and behavioral building blocks that, in ancient and modern humans, eventually assembled into what we recognize as religious or spiritual belief. The second question is considerably more interesting and considerably less easy to dismiss, because the evidence relevant to it keeps accumulating in ways that make animals are completely incapable of anything resembling religious cognition, an increasingly difficult position to maintain with a straight face in front of researchers who actually study animal behavior for a living. Let's talk about what religion and spiritual belief actually require at a cognitive level, because this is the foundation everything else in this conversation needs to rest on. Researchers studying the cognitive origins of religion have identified several underlying psychological capacities that appear to be necessary prerequisites for religious and spiritual belief. Capacities that, once established, seem to almost inevitably produce something resembling religion given enough time, social complexity, and cognitive development. These capacities include the ability to attribute mental states, intentions, and purposes to entities in the environment, what researchers call theory of mind, or intentionality attribution. They include a sense of agency detection, the tendency to perceive purposeful agents behind events even when no such agent is directly visible. They include some capacity for considering the possibility of minds or existence continuing beyond visible, physical presence. What researchers studying death cognition sometimes describe as symbolic immortality concepts. And they include genuine emotional responses to specific kinds of overwhelming, awe-producing experiences that feel qualitatively different from ordinary, everyday emotional reactions. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because essentially none of those cognitive capacities are exclusive to humans. Let's go through them one by one, because the animal evidence is considerably more compelling than most people expect. Theory of mind, the ability to attribute beliefs, intentions, and mental states to other entities, shows up most obviously in great apes, where researchers have documented sophisticated understanding of what other individuals can and cannot know, see, or believe in ways that go considerably beyond simple stimulus response behavior. Chimpanzees and bonobos demonstrate genuine understanding that other individuals have separate mental perspectives, can be deceived, can hold false beliefs, and can be manipulated through careful management of what information they have access to. All of which represents exactly the kind of mental state attribution that underlies religious cognition at its most basic level. Dogs, as we've discussed extensively in our earlier animal human relationship video, demonstrate sophisticated social cognition in ways that suggest meaningful mental state attribution capability, as does research on ravens, elephants, dolphins, and various other species, painting a picture of intentionality attribution as a considerably more widespread cognitive capability than researchers once assumed. Let's address agency detection specifically here, because this one is particularly relevant and particularly interesting. Agency detection, the tendency to perceive purposeful, intentional agents behind events, even when direct evidence for an agent is ambiguous, is widely considered one of the most direct cognitive precursors to religious belief in ancient and modern humans. We naturally, almost automatically attribute intention and purpose to events caused by unseen forces, storms, disease, unexpected death, earthquake, because detecting a hidden agent and responding appropriately when one actually is present is so much more important for survival than occasionally over-attributing agency to purely natural events with no real agent behind them. Evolutionary psychologist researchers studying this tendency have specifically proposed it as one of the primary reasons religious belief in supernatural agents appears so naturally and so consistently across all documented human cultures, ancient and modern alike. It's essentially an evolutionary byproduct of an agency detection system calibrated for genuine survival usefulness, running somewhat oversensitively in certain contexts where no actual agent exists. Do animals show agency detection beyond simple stimulus response threat detection? The evidence here is genuinely interesting and considerably less definitive, which is worth being honest about. What we can say is that various highly social, cognitively sophisticated animal species show behavioral responses to certain environmental events that go beyond simple, direct threat response, suggesting some level of attributing significance to occurrences beyond their immediate, direct physical explanation. The crow death ritual we mentioned at the very beginning of this video represents one documented example. Researchers studying corvid behavior around the bodies of dead flock members have documented that crows and ravens will gather around a dead individual, sometimes for extended periods, engaging in what appears to be something beyond pure threat assessment behavior. Behavior that seems to serve some kind of social cognitive function connected to processing a significant, unusual event rather than simply detecting and responding to a potential danger signal. Let's bring in elephant behavior here specifically, because elephants represent one of the most compelling, most frequently cited examples of something potentially resembling proto-religious behavior in a non-human animal. Researchers studying elephant behavior around death have documented genuinely remarkable, consistent patterns that have attracted serious scientific attention, not because researchers are anthropomorphizing carelessly, but because the behaviors are documented, consistent, and difficult to explain through simple, immediate survival benefit alone. Elephants return to the bones of deceased family members, sometimes years after that individual's death, engaging in extended, clearly non-predatory, non-foraging interaction with those remains that involves touching, manipulating, and apparently attending to the bones in ways that serve no obvious immediate practical function. They show differentiated behavioral responses to elephant remains versus non-elephant animal remains of comparable size, suggesting they specifically recognize and respond differently to the physical remnants of their own species in ways that carry specific emotional or cognitive significance beyond simple object assessment. Now, let's connect all of this directly back to ancient humans and their specific role in this story, because this is where the conversation becomes most directly relevant to this channel's focus and most genuinely illuminating regarding where human religious belief actually came from. We've established throughout this entire series that ancient humans were remarkably emotionally and cognitively sophisticated, capable of genuine love, grief, complex social bonding, accumulated cultural knowledge transmission, art, music, ritual, and deliberate ceremony. We've covered evidence of careful burial practices going back hundreds of thousands of years, deep cave art created in extraordinarily difficult, deliberate, clearly significant ritual contexts, and various other behaviors that suggest a rich, layered inner and social life going considerably beyond what simple survival demands alone could explain. All of these behaviors connect directly to the cognitive and emotional prerequisites for religious and spiritual belief that we just outlined. And the ancient cave paintings we opened this video with represent one of the most direct, most striking pieces of evidence that by at least 35,000 years ago, and almost certainly considerably earlier, ancient humans weren't just capable of religious cognition. They were actively, visibly expressing it. Let's go back to that cave wall and the older man painting his human antlered figure after a night of celebration, because this detail matters more than it might initially appear. That specific image, a human figure combined with animal features, particularly antlers or horns, represents one of the single most widespread, most consistently recurring motifs in ancient art across completely separate, geographically distinct ancient populations worldwide, showing up in southern France, in South Africa, in Siberia, in various other ancient contexts, suggesting this particular symbolic concept, a being combining human and animal characteristics, wasn't some isolated individual artistic choice. It was something that appeared naturally and repeatedly across ancient human populations with no direct contact with each other, which strongly suggests it represents something deeply rooted in the specific way ancient human cognition naturally engaged with the relationship between humans, animals, and whatever forces or entities seemed to govern the world they were trying to survive within. Let's talk about the awe dimension specifically because this connects to something genuinely important about why ancient human nightlife, the fermented honey, the music, the extended firelit social gathering we described at the opening, and religious experience might be more directly connected than they initially appear. Researchers studying religious experience across cultures have specifically identified awe, a feeling of overwhelming, self transcending significance in response to something vast or powerful, as one of the most consistent, most universal triggers for what people describe as spiritual experience. Awe tends to dissolve the sense of the self as a separate, bounded individual entity and produce a sense of connection to something larger, whether that's the natural world, a community, a cosmos, or a force, or being perceived as underlying and governing all of those things. Notably, researchers studying awe induction in modern experimental contexts have found that certain specific triggers, overwhelmingly beautiful natural phenomena, certain kinds of music and rhythmic activity, certain social experiences of intense collective synchrony, and certain mild alterations of consciousness all reliably produce awe-like states in modern humans. Ancient humans, gathered around a fire, engaged in rhythmic music and movement, occasionally assisted by whatever fermented substance happened to be circulating, were essentially running an awe induction session every single evening, entirely without realizing that's what they were doing. And the religious imagery that appeared on cave walls almost certainly reflected and reinforced the kinds of experiences those evenings regularly produced. Now let's address something genuinely important about whether any of this constitutes belief in God in a meaningful sense, because intellectual honesty matters throughout this entire series. What the animal evidence demonstrates is not that chimpanzees pray, or that elephants conceive of a creator deity, or that crows hold theological positions on the nature of the afterlife. What the animal evidence does demonstrate is that the specific cognitive and emotional building blocks underlying human religious and spiritual belief are not uniquely human inventions that appeared from nowhere. They are evolutionary developments rooted in genuine adaptive functions that show up to varying degrees across multiple species with sufficient social and cognitive complexity. Agency detection is evolutionarily useful. Theory of mind is evolutionarily useful. Death awareness and the behavioral responses it triggers appear across multiple species in ways suggesting genuine cognitive engagement with mortality beyond simple predator avoidance. And the emotional experiences of awe, connection, and collective meaning that ancient humans were regularly producing around their fires appear to be available to at least some extent across multiple cognitively complex species. Even if the specific symbolic and narrative frameworks ancient humans eventually built around those experiences are uniquely human products. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating here regarding what ancient humans' consistent engagement with religious and spiritual experience might have done for their actual survival prospects, because this connects to our earlier discussion about the role of shared cultural practice in building group cohesion. We covered in our previous video about being prey how essential strong group cohesion was to ancient human survival, and how various cultural practices, music, storytelling, shared celebration, appeared to serve genuine social bonding functions beyond pure entertainment value. Religious and spiritual practice fits directly into this pattern, probably more powerfully than almost any other cultural practice available to ancient humans, because shared religious or spiritual belief creates one of the strongest, most resilient forms of group identity and mutual obligation known to human social science. A group united by shared religious belief, shared ritual practice, shared understanding of what the universe fundamentally is and what their relationship to it means, possesses a genuinely different, more resilient social cohesion than a group united merely by convenience and shared resource access. Let's address something genuinely interesting about timing here, because it's worth noting directly that the most elaborate, most clearly intentional, ancient religious and spiritual art and behavior shows up with particular richness exactly during periods when ancient human groups were engaging in sustained creative and social activity of all kinds. Exactly the kinds of evenings we've been describing throughout this video, where food abundance combined with social gathering, music, and occasional fermented substance consumption to produce an environment maximally conducive to exactly the kind of awe-adjacent experiences that appear to underlie religious imagination. This isn't a coincidence. It's a direct, causal connection between the specific social and experiential conditions that ancient human nightlife regularly produced and the specific cognitive and emotional states that most directly feed the religious imagination, suggesting that ancient humanity's party culture and ancient humanity's spiritual development were never really separate phenomena at all. They were different aspects of the same essential human activity, gathering in community around warmth and shared experience and reaching together toward whatever seemed to lie just beyond the edge of what ordinary daily life could fully explain or contain. Now let's circle back to the central question this video was always working toward, because everything we've covered now fits together into an answer worth stating directly. Do animals actually believe in God? Based on the evidence of theory of mind in great apes and various other cognitively sophisticated species, agency detection as a likely widespread capacity across social mammals, genuinely documented behavioral responses to death in elephants, corvids, and certain other species that go beyond simple threat assessment, the emotional prerequisites for awe and collective meaning-making showing up in various forms across multiple highly social species, and the ancient human evidence demonstrating that by at least 35,000 years ago, and almost certainly considerably earlier, our species was actively producing and transmitting rich symbolic and ceremonial frameworks built directly on exactly these underlying cognitive and emotional foundations. The honest answer is, not in any theologically sophisticated, symbolically articulated sense, but perhaps in the precursor sense that matters more for understanding where religious belief actually comes from and what it actually is. Religious belief in ancient and modern humans doesn't appear to be some completely arbitrary, purely cultural invention with zero biological roots. It appears to be a natural, almost inevitable outgrowth of a specific combination of cognitive and emotional capacities, agency detection, theory of mind, death awareness, awe responsiveness, social bonding need, that are themselves evolutionary developments with genuine adaptive histories. Other cognitively sophisticated, highly social animals appear to possess at least some of these capacities to at least some degree, which means they may exist somewhere on the same broad continuum that ancient humans occupied before they developed the specific symbolic, narrative, and ceremonial frameworks that turn those underlying capacities into what we'd recognize as religion in a fuller sense. Whether that constitutes believing in God depends entirely on how you define both believing and God, and both of those definitions turn out, on examination, to be considerably less fixed and clear than they initially appear. And maybe that's genuinely the most interesting takeaway buried in this entire topic. The impulse toward religious and spiritual experience, toward perceiving something beyond the purely physical, toward finding meaning in the overwhelming and the inexplicable, toward gathering together in community to collectively reach toward something larger than individual survival, that impulse appears to be very, very old. Older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than any specific religious tradition or theological framework, older, possibly, than our specific species. It appears in ancient humans painting antlered figures on cave walls after an evening of fermented honey and shared music. And it appears, in perhaps its earliest, most elemental form, in an elephant touching the bones of someone it knew years after they're gone, apparently unable or unwilling to simply treat that moment as meaningless in a universe that hasn't yet offered any formal explanation for exactly what it means.